Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so happy to have you with us. We're here to really discuss how these amazing individuals in front of me and in front of you have gotten into med school and how you can follow in their footsteps. So we're so thankful that you are here. Please put your questions in the chat. We're going to be gathering those and bringing them into our discussion. My name is Liz, and I'm a Kaplan MCAT teacher. And when we are going to be thinking through the MCAT, there's a whole process involved there. But then we also have to think through all of your application, the decisions you're making about all the involvement you're doing on campus, your clubs, your leadership, and how that is going to really communicate who you are authentically to the schools that you are interested in. So we're going to be kind of touching on a lot of different things tonight, and we're excited to be able to do that with these folks. So just to give you context, everyone here has been accepted to medical school, so congratulations to each of them. And they're going to tell you just a little bit about themselves. So we're going to start with Madison. So Madison, can you tell us just about your undergrad, where you've been, what you've been up to, and what you hope to do in med school?
Yeah, so hey everyone, my name's Madison. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina. I'm finishing up undergrad at Clemson University. I've been studying health science. I'm headed to the Medical University of South Carolina next year down in Charleston. And like many students, I don't really know what field I want to go into, but I'm definitely interested in becoming an OBGYN.
Wonderful. And what about you, Peter?
Hey everyone, so my name is Peter Chen and I am in Seattle, Washington, studying at the University of Washington in Seattle. I am majoring in microbiology. And as for medical school, I will be attending Albert Einstein this upcoming fall in New York, but not sure exactly what specialty I'd like to go into. Dermatology is something that interests me as well as like immunology and allergies, but I'm not quite sure and, keeping an open mind for now.
Wonderful. And how about you, Camryn?
Hey everyone, my name is Camryn. I'm currently in Gainesville, Florida right now, attending the University of Florida and graduating in like a week. So it's exciting. I majored in biology with a minor in health disparities in society, and I will be going to Wake Forest School of Medicine for medical school. Very excited about that. And like Peter and Madison, honestly, I'm going in with an open mind. Right now, I'd be between like primary care or psychiatry, as those two really interest me, but definitely going in with an open mind and excited to see where the future takes us.
Well, in thinking back, Camryn, at what point did you really start actively planning to apply to medical school and sort of start gearing your life in that direction?
Yeah, so my story is kind of personal, but my father passed away when I was younger. My mom raised me and my sister by herself, and seeing her care for us like she did really pushed me to think about medicine initially in high school. And so I started doing a little bit of medical in high school, and then college, I went like full-fledged volunteering and all the extracurriculars for medical school. And I think that really solidified my desire to be a physician. And I think really it isn't like one point, but I think just the culmination of all of those events together just really pushed me towards this path. And I really couldn't imagine it any other way.
Hmm. And I know, Madison, you're part of a special program, so your journey might look a little bit different. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm actually enrolled in a program through my college. And essentially what that is I've spent 3 years in undergrad, and now I'm going to go ahead to medical school. I took the MCAT, applied normal, just like everything. And once getting accepted, I'll be going there, starting medical school like just a normal student there. But my first medical school year, I'll send my transcript back and my university will grant me my degree after doing only 3 years. So basically, I'm saving out on a whole year of college tuition and finishing up undergrad a little bit sooner. So if anyone's interested in things like that, I would definitely recommend kind of finding programs like that in your college. I know that many of them have similar types of things. And if that's something that you know early on in your medical school career or in college, I would definitely recommend it.
Wonderful. And Peter, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I guess I started thinking about doing medicine probably like in high school-ish. I had a pretty personal story with like having eczema and like, seeing my dermatologist a lot and really knowing like how big of a difference like a doctor can make in one person's life. Obviously there's many other different professions that do that, but with medicine in particular, I just thought like, oh my gosh, it's not just like this skin condition that you're able to help. It's like literally every other part and aspect of my life a doctor is able to impact. So that's kind of how I started. And then in college, I did the same thing. My journey is pretty similar to Camryn's. I, got involved in a lot of extracurriculars, did research, still doing research, and took the MCAT. And now as a senior, looking forward to medical school in the fall.
Well, Peter, let's just talk for a minute about how much time you gave yourself thinking about taking the MCAT. And you're talking about research, you're talking about obviously keeping your GPA strong and all your other leadership and activities. So how did you think about when was the right time to take it and how much time to devote to it? Sort of talk us through your mindset on that.
Yeah, so for me, I was fortunate enough to be able to take some classes in the summer. So I was able to kind of build in more time. So actually for my MCAT studying, I think this is probably more like geared towards my mindset is I really like focusing on something and only one thing if I really want to do it super well. So I started planning probably in my freshman year. Like I knew that in my junior year, I would probably take 1 quarter off. So I took my spring quarter off. UW is on a quarter system. So I had like a 3-month gap in which I was just studying for the MCAT. And like doing a little research and stuff on the side, but really the bulk of it was the MCAT studying. So I really started thinking like pretty early, and that paid off well for me. But I kind of knew like, oh, I didn't want to take a gap year. I would try applying in my senior year. So kind of backtracking from there, I think is really important.
Yeah, and Madison, when you think about schedule, because I know we had some questions coming through from the chat just about like how to break that time down. And, so tell us a little bit about how long you studied, but also just how you thought about breaking that time up and what you did during that time.
Sure. So I'm kind of similar to Peter. My schoolwork takes a lot out of me. And so I knew that if I wanted to do well on the MCAT, that I would have to make that my number one focus. Kind of interestingly, I was fortunate that I was studying for the MCAT during COVID. And while that definitely added some extra stress, it also took away some of the distractions that I would have had if that had not been the case. So I wasn't really missing out on things that I was studying that summer. Usually you think of missing a whole summer to study and you're missing out on friend time. And I really didn't have that. But with that being said, I started studying in February, and then I took the MCAT in July. But kind of that whole time, it had just transitioned to online school. So I really devoted that entire time to MCAT studying. I would definitely recommend just figuring out what works best for you. I would say taking the MCAT is not just adding another class to your schedule. Like it really is almost like a full-time job. And so I think if I were to have studied while I was in school, I definitely would have had to do that on a longer timeline. But since I was able to just do that, like seriously, like 5, 6, 8 hours a day, then I really condensed it and I was able to just kind of get it over with in just one summer.
That's great. Camryn, what was yours like?
So I studied for the MCAT while taking 13 credits and doing a bunch of other extracurriculars. I wouldn't recommend it, but if that's what your timeline has, it's definitely doable. So I began studying in like mid-December and I had planned to take the MCAT in April, but due to COVID, we got pushed back a couple of months. So I didn't end up taking it until July, but I took about a month and a half break from MCAT studying when COVID hit, just due to like mental health reasons and adjusting. But so I had planned about 3.5 months to study for the MCAT, and I broke mine up into like a month of content review, a month of practice problems, and a month of just the AAMC material and going over that. And I think that worked out really well. And I think really keeping a balance, if you do have to do it with classes and extracurriculars, you are going to have to sacrifice some stuff like your social life, some aspects of that. Don't get me wrong, you definitely should schedule breaks for yourself and go hang out with friends, read a book, do something that you enjoy, but be ready the MCAT is like a full-time job, and so be ready to just accept that. But keep a really strict schedule for yourself. Try not to get off track. And if you do get off track, like that's okay. The biggest piece of advice though, like please like take a break. Your mental health is so important. The MCAT is just as much as a mental game as it is like physically learning content and practice problems. So I highly, highly recommend. I took every Wednesday off. I would focus out on myself and some other schoolwork I'd have to do and just not think about the MCAT. And I think that attributed a lot of success to studying, especially amidst COVID, is really just staying true to yourself and really taking care of yourself.
I love that note because especially for folks like Camryn, where it was like right up to it, and then all the COVID, it was like, and then it kept getting pushed back. Like all last spring, it'd be like, oh, that no, oh, It's I know everyone kind of has that feeling at some point in their life, but that was especially true for the MCAT takers last spring that you all are survivors of. But I think it's actually really a great note about resilience and grit, because that's absolutely something that you all are going to be utilizing in medical school, and being able to recognize when you're at your limit. So I love that you were able to take that time and be successful. One of the things I wanted to think about was like, and really we'll start with you, Madison, like when you hit a wall or when you were discouraged with the MCAT, like how did you kind of keep moving forward, even though you didn't feel maybe like you were making progress or you were feeling a little discouraged?
Yeah, so I think what Camryn was saying was like super important, and she was highlighting some really good notes. It's important to prepare that you will hit those walls many times during the MCAT. It's definitely an emotional roller coaster, and your confidence is always spinning. So I definitely would say when I was starting to kind of hit that wall, it was definitely necessary for me to take a day off. Unlike Camryn, I didn't really have a set day off that I took every week. It was really kind of when I had just hit my breaking point, I maybe would study for just a few hours in the morning and give myself the rest of the day off. But I think definitely prioritizing and finding outlets that are totally separate from the MCAT and just getting you away from it and having your mind off of it is definitely beneficial. And you think you may need to have that last minute studying, but like Camryn said, the break is honestly like just as good for you.
Awesome. Yeah. And Peter, what about you? What were some of the ways that you handled those setbacks or some of those feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it sounds like all of our stories are kind of similar, especially with COVID. Like that was already a hard time, and then it was like times two. Um, I guess for me, like I found hobbies that I enjoyed doing and that like, I was able to kind of take my mind off things. So I really enjoyed cooking and like playing piano too was another de-stressor. So kind of finding other different passions that are nowhere related to like medicine or whatever, and it's just purely for yourself, I think really helps with, your mental sanity, honestly, with the MCAT. So I just finding those enjoyable things that are purely for yourself and nothing else.
Well, one of the things we just saw come through that I think might be relevant here, Peter, is that obviously last year the MCAT got moved. And so even your best laid plans, Camryn, for having a nice April MCAT score and being able to then apply and all of that just kind of got twisted around. So we had some questions about like, well, how does that work? And how do you get verified with your application if you don't have your MCAT scores? Or like, what's the best way to, do you just apply to one school? Like, how do you play around with all of that? So we'll throw that one to Peter first, and then Camryn will come to you too.
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, so my story was I was planning on taking the MCAT in May, I believe, and then I was gonna set aside time to do like my personal statement and stuff. Unfortunately, that I got delayed, I think by like 3 or 4 weeks, which turned out to be okay, but it was definitely very stressful. During that time, I did get my scores in time to submit. So the MCAT scores, once they come in, they automatically get submitted to all the schools. So that's not something that one should worry about. Like once you've taken the MCAT, like personally, I think that the primary goal is to get your primary application done and submitted, because what very few people realize is that AMCAS has to verify your application, and the longer you wait or the later into the cycle you wait, the longer they take to verify. So I think for mine, like it took like 2 to 3 weeks. And the special exception last year was they had moved their sending primary apps to everyone like by like a couple weeks, I think. So I got lucky. But it's really important to send your primary app as soon as it's done. I know that we all say it's rolling, but MCAT sets one specific date where they start sending out all these primary apps to everyone. And if you miss that deadline, then you're going to be delayed for the rest of everything. So you're not going to get your secondaries as fast as everyone. And it's just kind of a snowball effect. So I would say get it in as early as possible and don't worry too much about the MCAT because that will get automatically submitted.
Yeah, and I can follow up on this. And a good distinction to note is this is just strictly for AMCAS, for MD programs. For DO, ACOMAS, and the Texas MD programs are a little bit different. But strictly for AMCAS, I also faced a challenge with Peter. I had planned to have my MCAT done and score back before the apps opened. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so I think a key thing to note is that you don't have to have your MCAT score back before you need to send in your primary application. If you do want to apply that very first day that your app gets sent out to schools, you need to have it back before that date. So for example, this upcoming cycle, the application opens like May 3rd. It starts, you can send it like May 28th, and then in June, I think it's June 24th. Don't know if that's correct, but it's somewhere around there. It starts getting transmitted. So to have your MCAT score back before the June 24th date. And what I did was I just finished my application on the last week of May, sent it in the first day you could submit it, but I didn't have an MCAT score. My MCAT score ended up getting back 3 days before apps actually got sent to schools. And so really, you can have it on like that same timeline. And then once you get your MCAT score back, you can add all those schools. And keep in mind, once it's verified and they start transmitting, anytime you add a school, it gets automatically sent to them. And so, yeah, big takeaway, just have your MCAT score back by the day they start transmitting, as long, or if you do want to apply that first day. So yeah, that's exactly what I did. I just submitted it with one school to get verified. And then once it was verified, I added more with the MCAT score.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to back up a little bit in that process and talk, Madison, just about how did you approach planning out and preparing your application? So how did you think about the steps that you were going to need to do, who you're going to ask to do your references, those kinds of things?
So yeah, for the application, I was filling out my application, writing primaries, secondaries, all while I was studying for the MCAT, which I would not recommend. Definitely do one at least at a different time. Doing both in that summer was definitely too much, and I would definitely not advise. As far as letters of recommendation, that was one of the things that I struggled with for sure. I didn't struggle a ton in school in a lot of my classes. And so I necessarily wasn't the student that was always going to office hours or always, interacting with my professors, especially after COVID and a lot of things went online. And so I applied to medical school after my sophomore year. So I really only had larger gen ed classes really under my belt at that point. So it was definitely difficult for me to find these professors to write really good, solid recommendations. So if I have any advice to you guys going through, I would definitely start working on solidifying those relationships early on. Maybe after the semester, if you have a good professor, email them right then and say, hey, I'm not applying to medical school right now, but just so that you remember this later on, like I would be interested in you writing me a recommendation, like in a year or 2 years or something like that, just so that they can have that in mind and you can kind of have something to go back to. And maybe you could type up some notes about the class just so that they can remember you. That was something that came up in one of my interviews actually as like a weakness in my overall application and something that I had known about going into and had to prepare a response for. But yeah, like I said, don't make mistakes like I do and definitely start working on that and getting those recommendations and things way early on.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think everybody got caught last year. So you guys are rock stars. You made it through this whole rocky process, but it's a perennial issue with the references, and it's always a challenge. People feel like, oh, I don't want to make somebody do something for me. They love it. So it's really, I think, for a lot of folks, it's an honor to be able to support you in your journey. So don't feel bad about asking people to do that. Don't feel bad about saying, I loved your class. I think you would be a great person to be able to write this reference. And I do think I love that the notes that Madison talked about, being able to say, like, these are why I enjoyed your class, and this is how I feel like it's going to help me be a better doctor, and, you know, really be a contributing point towards your future career. So I love that. I know earlier, Peter, we had some questions about, like, how did you choose which of your experiences to highlight and things like that as well. So if you want to talk about recommendations, rock on, but, you know, also think about, how did you think about some of those top experiences and what to highlight?
Yeah, I think that first with the recommendation letters, I would say like it's never too early to ask. So like even like after you had this really awesome class that you took and you connected really well with that teacher, like I had one of those experiences, I think in my sophomore year. I had reached out to her like right after the class. So she would remember me and I could kind of book that spot. So it's never too early to reach out. Another pro tip, I think if a professor says they might not be able to write you a strong letter of rec, it's probably best not to go with them. And it's really good that they actually tell you that because it's honest and you want someone that's going to be able to highlight your skills. So if you find someone like that, find someone else is my pro tip there. In terms of actual experiences, I would say that medical schools do really like when you have like clinical experiences for me. So like I think one of my most meaningful was shadowing. And it isn't necessarily, and I received some feedback from medical schools that I applied to that I got rejected from. Like they give me some personalized feedback. And the overarching thing is it doesn't really matter like they focus less on what the actual experience is versus what you actually take away from the experience. And I think that's so important to keep in mind is that, you know, I know a lot of people stress over like, what should I do? And like, you know, like, what should I put my time and focus on? But in reality, it's what you take away from it and what you learn from it and how you're able to highlight that on your application. So I would say that when you're choosing your experiences for your application, you really need to focus on like where did you learn most from and how are you able to highlight your best qualities based off of that experience. So that's kind of my advice. It's not like super straightforward, but that's what I would say.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if someone is a younger student and they're doing some things because they think you got to do this if you're going to apply to medical school, like maybe you don't. But I think that there are going to be some great opportunities in other places, and if you can speak passionately about it, then it's going to be much more valuable
Exactly.
space for you to be. Yeah, they're looking for authenticity. They're looking for you to be like, oh, I'd love to talk about, you know, that particular experience. Camryn, how did you think about what to highlight as far as experiences?
Yeah, so really it just comes down like exactly what Peter was saying is like writing the impact that the experience had on you and like the impact that you had on it. So you could have like a small amount of hours for something, but really it's quality over quantity. Um, for example, I only volunteered I volunteered in a hospice center for like I think 40 hours. And like in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot of hours over the 3 years of undergrad. But man, the patients I was able to meet, the stories I was able to hear, and really just the connections I was able to make with those patients it was truly like a formative experience on me. And I wrote about that. I wrote truly and honestly about exactly what these experiences brought to me. And I tried to really show, and I know the whole show don't tell. I really tried to show in like a story what I really got from that experience. And I think it comes down to just bringing in like who you are as a person. They just want to get to know who you are. Um, and really, it's not recommended to just make your application like a resume style and just list all of these things that you did because they know what a teaching assistant did. They know what like an EMT does. But you need to talk about how that experience shows who you are and shows your story versus listing what it does or what you did in that position. So that's definitely the best advice I have out there is that show don't tell, but show who you are.
One of the tips that Maria Loftus, one of our consultants, always gives, which I absolutely love, is that there's a list of core competencies for physicians, and to really look at your activities and your character and look at those core competencies and just connect the dots. So don't assume that they're going to connect the dots between, you know, that this particular, like, for example, compassion that you developed for those hospice patients, that's going to necessarily be clear, but tell a story about how you grew in your compassion for others through perhaps this experience volunteering in your hospice care. I have a similar story to your hospice care, where I worked in a spinal cord injury clinic, and it had been what was the first time I had been exposed to folks from the whole spectrum of, recently injured all the way through, fully rehabilitated, and just being able to see that full perspective was very impactful to me. And just the journey that these amazing patients were on to, first of all, just own their bodies, but also just to heal in all of the senses of that was such a powerful experience for me as well. And so I think the more you can connect that inner journey, that inner life and character development to the things that you're doing, the more powerful it's going to read. That was actually, I had a question about that. So I'm going to put you guys on the spot a little bit, but when you think about, and I'll warn you, when you think about yourself and how those interviews went, what do you think stood out from the pack about your application? And I'll let you think about it for half a second, because I know it's a hard question. But when we think about, most folks applying to med school have strong GPAs. They've got strong MCAT scores. They've been leaders. They've been, like we've said, accomplishing a lot of things, doing research, ticking all of the boxes that we all know that we want to tick. What do you think it is about your application that stood out from that pack? So I'm going to put Madison in the hot seat first and give Peter and Camryn here a second to think a little bit more. What do you think, Madison?
Sure. So I actually got a little bit of feedback on my personal statement and got some compliments on that. In my statement, I kind of discussed my youngest sister has a lot of medical problems, and that was kind of what exposed me to the medical field early on. And so I kind of talked about how that not only affected her, but also affected me and inspired me to pursue a career in medicine. And some of the compliments that I got on it was at times very raw and vulnerable, just talking about, how that affected me, or just like my not emotional struggles, but just kind of how that affected me and my family, and kind of turned that into a positive and kind of directed that really to my passion for medicine. So my advice for that would just find why you want to become a doctor, and really tune that in and think about that, and think about, everything that led you to that decision. And I really just kind of put it out all on the line. It was a little bit of, it's not risky, but I wasn't really sure if it was what I should be saying in the personal statement, but I was like, this is my story and this is my why. And so I just kind of went for it, and it was received very positively. And so you definitely don't want to focus on the negatives, but it's okay to, you want to seem personal, they don't think of you as a person all the time. It's just your application. And so you really want them to get to know you through your personal statement, rather than just, this isn't the place to highlight your activities or things that you've been doing. Like, this is really your chance to show them like why you want to be a doctor, or why you want to go to medical school.
Wonderful. What about you, Camryn?
So I think mine, similar to Madison, I think I was very raw and vulnerable across my entire application. I talked about like growing up and struggles that I had, especially like having just a single parent, losing my father. And I think I tied a lot of that to why I want to pursue medicine, and how that's really pushed me. And I definitely think it was like very personal, and I think they call it a personal statement for a reason. But I'm going back to like, I think I really showed who I was as a person in my writing, rather than just, here's what I did. This is why I want to be a doctor. I told a story. I told like the culmination of events that really brought me to that point. And while I was interviewing, I got a couple of compliments on my personal statement, just saying how like it was very vulnerable. It was very like real, instead of just, again, like, this is what I did. This is it, and I think that really can make someone stand out, is like really pouring your heart out into these application, and like the primary, the secondaries, and really, I know I've said this like a billion times, but tell your story, tell them who you are, and really be convincing to yourself and to the applications of like why medicine is the only route that you want to go, and to become a physician is the only route that you want to go. So I really hope that helps out there, but really just tell your story. I know I said it a ton of times, but yeah.
That's great. What about you, Peter? What do you think made you stand out from the pack?
Oh, I mean, I, I can't point to one particular thing, but I would say that several things that, stand out to me at least is like having reviewed over like other people's like medical school applications before. I think one of the hardest things to answer is why medicine and why not something else. And the most common thing is like, oh, people say, oh yeah, I want to help people. Like there needs to be something more than just that. And even then it's like, well, then why can't you do something else in healthcare? Why does it have to be a physician? So really having to think through like exactly why medicine and why a physician in particular, I think is really important and really important to convey on an application, especially for medical school. So I would say I think that I conveyed that pretty well, and I was able to kind of think through exactly why. And I know the entire application process, just in general, is a lot of soul searching and a lot of questioning your own values, what you believe in, all of that sort of stuff. So it kind of puts you like in a state of uncertainty, like for like I even like a whole year, because you're waiting to hear back and waiting to hear if you said the right things. But I would say that, and then also I know it's good to like highlight good things about yourself, but I would also say it's okay to be humble on your application and be able to say like, there was this one time where I screwed up in this, and this is what I learned from it, and this is how like I applied it to my future. So being able to be really real, like Camryn and Madison have echoed, is being raw and vulnerable, and being able to admit mistakes, and being able to kind of come back from that and showing that, because med schools know we're not perfect. So it's not, we don't have to fake our way through it, I would say. So, and then the last thing, just don't sleep on the work and activity section. I know that a lot of people like focus on the personal statement, and that's super important, but I will say work and activities is like the other half of the application, basically, that is equally considered. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's hard, especially when we don't yet have that open. If you've never seen one before, you could probably find some PDFs out there that can at least give you some idea as to what it all looks like. But if you've never opened up one before, there's a boatload of just demographic information. Who are you? Who's your family? What education level do they have? It's a lot. And so, it's going to take a while just to work your way through that part. But then, as folks have noted, there's going to be places where you'll need to handle your own educational background, and then you'll list out a lot of work and activities. You'll say which of these three are the most important to you. You'll upload your personal statement, all those pieces. So we had some questions come through about what does it mean to get verified? And so what that means is you put all that primary application information into the system, and then the system has to go say, oh, are you really Liz Dalton? Is this really your social security and your date of birth? Is this really your grades? Like, so they just go through, it's kind of like getting a background check. And it's just like, hey, yeah, you're verified all along the way. And that's really your GPA. And these are really your, all those pieces. And so you're a real person. You're not a robot. It just takes a little bit longer when we're talking about so much information on the application.
I will add on to that real quick. For that verification process, it's really important to make sure that all your information is correct, because if you like input a couple incorrect grades or whatever, they will send it back to you and your application will be delayed. So it's really important to triple check over your application prior to sending it off for verification, or else you might get put into the other pool. Even if you were early on everything, that could delay your process by like a whole month. Not to stress people out, but it's important to know.
We're already stressed out, Peter. It's all good. Speaking of being stressed out, actually, great questions came in about that interview process. So things don't always go the way you planned. So I'd love to, again, just kind of ask, like, what was a curveball that got thrown to you? Some of the hard questions that you saw in your interview. I'll just start with you, Peter. What was one of those hard ones that you got tossed?
Yeah, I would say that, okay, one of the most important things, like if you do get an interview from a school and they send you the name of the interviewer, make sure to look into your interviewer and know who your interviewer is. So you can kind of, okay, so like, for example, like for one of my interviews, I had a PhD person interviewing me, like a researcher, like very research intensive. So one of the questions they asked me was, like, I was talking about this drug that I was prescribed and like how it helped my own skin condition. And then he asked me, so do you know the pathway for that, like the mechanism of action for your drug that you're taking? And
Wow.
fortunately I did, but it's important to kind of know, like, not, I think that was a kind of a very rare question to get, but it's important to know what you're talking about and know it thoroughly. And then also because I knew he was a researcher, like I think we spent like probably like a good 2/3 of that interview talking about research I was doing in the lab. So it's important to know who your interviewer is for sure, and know what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Camryn, what about you?
Yeah, so just a little tip before I talk about the interviews. You can find interview questions online. I know Student Doctor Network has people post old questions that they get from schools. So if you're prepping for a specific school, you can go on Student Doctor Network and see what people have been asked in the past to prepare. That's what I did for some of my interviews. But I think the hardest ones for me were the more creative, abstract questions. I had one interviewer ask me if I could go back in time or in the future and bring something back to the present day, what would I bring? And like there's just so many possibilities you could say there. And I was like, oh man. And so that brings me to another tip is like, it's okay to say, let me think about that for a second. And then just process the question and then speak, because you don't want to just jump in and ramble. You want to like sound like presentable, eloquent. So it's okay to say like, let me think about that. And that's what I did. And I was like, like, let me think about that for a second. And then I went into speaking about it. But yeah, be prepared. They may ask you questions like not related to medicine, just to really get to know who you are. So it won't like all be related to like medical stuff. Some may be, some may not be, but just be prepared for more abstract questions in some scenarios.
How about you, Madison? What were some of the crazy questions you saw?
I think one thing I was kind of expecting it. You know, a piece of advice: know your application, know your strengths, know your weaknesses. You know the things going into it that you may be lacking in some areas, and your strengths. I had one interview where she really kind of grilled me on the things that I was missing about my application, and I was definitely frustrated, being like, "Oh, well, look what I do have," but it's kind of how you navigate that question and how you turn the negatives into the positives. I may not have this, but I have this, and this is how, this may be why, and maybe not focus too much on the nitty gritty about why you don't have these things, but really kind of turn that negative into a positive and show that you can handle the tough questions and you can be self-reflective and kind of know your own strengths and know your weaknesses as well. And just kind of, like I said, turn negatives into good things and try to turn it around back on them, and just show that you're emotionally capable and that you are human and you can respond back to those types of things.
I love the way you said that, emotionally capable and human. That's who we all are, right? You don't have to be some fake version of who you are. One of the things that you said actually kind of sparked this question. You talked about knowing your strengths and your weaknesses in your application, and it just made me think about like, who were your people? Like, who were your people that looked at your application and helped you know what your strengths and weaknesses were, or helped you review your personal statement, or who did you talk to when you're like, well, which of these activities should I choose as my top 3? So just kind of, I'd love to talk about resources gathering and like how you navigated that with friends, family, people at school, resources, things like that. So I'll start with you, Madison, on that question. So what resources did you use?
So I used, I'm the first of my family to go to medical school. And so I'm kind of navigating this on my own, trying to kind of figure out the whole process. And in addition to that, because I'm doing this early program, I really was the first of my friends to also go through it. A lot of my friends are starting to go through it now. So I'm able to give them advice, but I didn't really have anyone to give advice to me. So I really sought help in my school, in my advising office. I met with my school's pre-health advisor many, many times. She had looked over my application. She had read my personal statement. She hooked me up with some people to do some interview prep. And so I think using your resources is extremely important. And it's extremely important to also, get that help. One pair of eyes looking at your personal statement is definitely not enough. Get as many people as you can to read it. Even my friends were helping me. And even if it's not related to medicine, they can help me with my grammar. They can help me word sentences better. They can help me, just get the general idea of what my personal statement or your activity section or things like that are portraying. So I would definitely just take all the help that you can get and have as many people as you can read over your things and just give you some feedback.
What did that look like for you, Camryn?
Yeah. So fortunately, I had my sister is also going through this process with me. I'm a twin. So fortunately, we had each other. But a lot of times, like it got to the point where some stuff was similar, so we needed other eyes. So a lot of what I utilized was people who were older than me who had just gone through the process and who hadn't entered medical school yet. So that's May. When you start the application in May, they hadn't entered medical school yet. So if you're in any like clubs, organizations, any of your volunteering, like reach out to those students who have just gone through the process and who have learned a lot about it. So for example, I actually talked to an exec board member in the club that I'm in, and she helped me with a lot of stuff. Like I asked so many questions about like letters of rec, transcripts, all that. And she really helped guide me through the process. And I think that's a really underutilized source is people who just went through it, other students just in the same boat. And then besides that, I didn't really use my school's academic advising much, but I did use like our writing center. They looked at my personal statement as well as a writing professor that I had. And then you can also, I'm not sure if all schools do this, but I believe most do, where you can set up like mock interviews. And they'll like go over your interview tips and stuff with you. But just having peers, even friends, I think it's good to get like someone who knows the application to read it and then someone who doesn't know the application to read it so they can catch all the grammatical mistakes and stuff. So definitely students, peers, people who just went through this, as well as like those professionals. So that's what I did.
That's great. How about you, Peter?
I would say that for like resources and stuff, like so much is online now. I mean, like, it's not shameful to say, like, use like Student Doctor Network, use Reddit, like, like, take it all with a grain of salt, obviously, but at the same time, there's definitely some good resources out there. Like, for example, like for MCAT studying, like, in addition to taking the Kaplan course, like, a lot of my resources came from like the Anki MCAT subreddit. Like, there's like Anki, if you don't know, it's like this fancy flashcard application, and there's pre-med decks online. So I would say that's one of the most useful resources I've seen online, and I definitely used in terms of the actual application and stuff. Like, definitely close friends. Like, I I I'm very grateful for them because they can probably recite my application now at this point, like the number of times they read it. So it's just so important to kind of have those close connections and being able to get people that do know the medical school process and people who don't, because they offer very different perspectives. But the most important thing is to get people that know you and know the best parts of you, and know what parts that you might not be able to see personally that they may be able to help point out to you, or like suggest, hey, maybe you should highlight this, or remember that time you did this, or whatever. So it's a collective group effort, and definitely don't be afraid to utilize those resources that are available.
That's great. I think really what I'm hearing the most is like explore your options. And thankfully we've got a lot of them. I know some folks came in to the chat saying, well, if your school doesn't have that pre-med or pre-health advisor, I'm like clubs, YouTube, Reddit, like you've got a lot of resources out there. Always want to remind you, we've got great events going on usually at least once a month, also with our great pre-med advisors. So you can always learn more here with us as well at Kaplan. We always want to support you on your journey. But yeah, there's so much great information out there. Throw out the bad, keep the good. There's quite a lot of misinformation out there as well. But if you're getting reputable sources, you can really get yourself at least on the right track. But I love that, Peter, and I think each person echoed this idea that the personal statement in particular is sort of your first introduction. It's that handshake moment, that is that elevator pitch, whatever analogy you want to pull. So really make sure that someone who knows you can read it and they go, oh, of course that's Peter, right? Or, oh, of course that's Madison. Like, it just sounds like that person. And so then you're able to say, okay, so when I walk in and I do my interview, they're not like, are we talking to the right person? Like, that doesn't sound like you at all. So we want to make sure that all those balances are going to be made. I think one of the interesting questions that we have is just really, what is something that you wish you had known about this process? Like, especially now you've all been accepted. And so it's like your stress levels have kind of come down, at least about this part of life. And so as we think about that, like, Camryn, what's something that you wish you had known kind of this time last year, going into this process, that you feel like maybe folks will be encouraged to know now?
Do not underestimate the secondaries, please. There is a lot of writing in applying to medical school, especially if you're applying to like 20 plus schools. Each school will send you a secondary ranging from no essays to like 12 essays for some schools. Usually, most of them are like 2 or 3, but there are the schools that have like 12. But it practically is a full-time job. Like, if you can just take a couple of weeks to dedicate to your secondary applications, I highly recommend it. I underestimated it, and man, was I like very, very, very burnt out from writing at the end of it, to the point where at the end I was like, oh man, should I even submit these last couple of secondaries? Like, do I really have it in me? But if I had prepared ahead of time, given myself more time, maybe even pre-write them, that was a lot because COVID happened and my timeline got messed up. But if I could do it again, I would pre-write some. You can find school secondaries from the previous year on Student Doctor Network and some other websites. But do not underestimate them. They are time consuming, expensive, and just a lot all at once, especially when they start flooding in. So be mentally and physically prepared to write those when they come.
Yeah, I've heard that from so many folks that it just gets overwhelming. And so folks who aren't familiar with what a secondary is, once you've sent in your primaries and you're all verified and you're going through, most schools will just go ahead and send you some additional essay-based questions. And so that's what we call the secondaries. And as Camryn said, sometimes it's like 2 questions and sometimes it's like 12. So that there's a varying, and sometimes they want, a really overly short answer, so it's hard. And then sometimes they want something really long, so it's hard. So there's lots of different requirements that can come along. Madison's, what's something that you wish that you had known this time last year?
I think the biggest thing personally, not really related to the process itself, but like I said with the MCAT, just be prepared to have those days that you're just not on your A game, or that the process is just really hitting you. Doing all of that in 1 year is crazy. You're studying for the MCAT, writing all of these essays, interviewing, waiting on getting in. It is emotionally tolling, to say the least. And I think one of the things, you're aware of that going into it, but then once you're actually there, it's on a whole other level. And I guess I just wasn't expecting like how much stress that the whole process would really have put on me. Now that I'm there, it's easy to say that it was okay, but while I was going through it, it definitely wasn't easy. I would say just to try to prepare yourself as best you can for that. Definitely schedule breaks and things like that you can, that you enjoy, that can make the process like not so hard, and definitely surround yourself with good people that will be willing to kind of support you through the hard times and also celebrate you when things finally go well.
Peter?
Gosh, well, I would say that one of the things is I didn't realize how long the process is, just like in general. Like, you think like, oh, after primaries and after secondaries we're good, and like the stress levels will decrease. Unfortunately, they don't. They maybe decrease like slightly, but then like you don't realize that every single day that you wake up for the next like 5 months, you're going to be like, the first thing you check is your email or like the junk mail, and seeing like, did I get an interview from a school? So it's, I guess, to go off of that, like, maybe I'm just super neurotic, but like I think that most people like are always constantly checking like for these invites, or like, did I get accepted? It's important to, rely and lean on those around you. I think that this process is incredibly difficult, especially on your own. So being able to kind of rely on those around you, I think, is something that I wish I could have told myself back then I should do more. And just take some time for yourself and constantly remind yourself, like, this is not the end all be all. So yeah.
Peter, I wanted to come back to you and ask, we had some questions about choosing which schools to apply to. So you're obviously going from the West Coast to the East Coast. Like,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your research process. And Camryn noted it's expensive. So that, not everyone is going to have the same budget as far as how many schools they can apply to. So how did you process through all that?
Well, I would say that if there's going to be any necessary optional expense, it's going to be the MSAR. I would say that it's very hard to decide like what medical schools to apply to without like the statistics that the MSAR, which is like I don't even know what it stands for, but it's from the AAMC, and it provides you like an overview of like average MCATs, average GPAs, like what specialties do people go into, how many people apply in-state, out-of-state interviews, and all that. Medical school admissions requirements. Thank you, Camryn. But I think what I did was I took my MCAT score, I took my GPA, I looked at so people usually separate it into different buckets. So there are like reach schools, there are like mid-tier, like your target schools, and then there's like your safeties. I will say there's no such thing as safeties in like medical school. Like there's no guarantee, like literally nothing. Like even if you are outstanding 520 MCAT or whatever, like you could still be rejected from like a safety school that you might classify. So word of caution. But I kind of took my MCAT, my GPA, kind of looked at what schools like fit around that, and then I did like a range. And then I thought about location, where would I be happy, where would I not be happy? So like for me personally, like I'm more city, like I'm a city person, so I kind of targeted more schools that fit that lifestyle. And then also keeping in mind like how many out of state school, like because most of the schools that you might apply to are probably out of state. Like at least for me in Seattle, like I applied to the University of Washington and Washington State University. Those are the only two like MD medical schools in Washington State. But it's important to look at other schools and their acceptance rates for out of state people, because there are some in which like I remember I was about to apply to one school in California that was a UC, and then I looked at their stat, and for their first year class that year, they only accepted one out of like, I don't know, like 3,000, like 5,000 applicants that were out of state. So it's not worth spending or like wasting your money basically on that one school, unless you think you're super special that you're going to be that 1 out of 5,000 people that gets it. That's out of state. So make sure to do your research.
No, I think that's really helpful to think about filtering that through. Camryn, was your experience similar, or did you do some different things?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that everyone's going to have different priorities when they come to picking a med school. But really, kind of the unfortunate truth is a lot of it you do have to base on your GPA and your MCAT. And so I did something similar to Peter, where I took my GPA and my MCAT. I got a range of schools, and then I chose from those based on location and where I would see myself happy, fitting the mission. I ended up applying to 24 schools. And again, it'll be different for everyone per your budget, per how many you want to apply to. But really, I took the MSAR, which I think is an amazing resource. Highly recommend getting it. They also have a Black Friday sale around Thanksgiving time. But highly recommend it. You can look at the admission statistics and then really base your list on those public and private schools, because those out-of-state public schools, 9 out of 10 times, they're going to take so many more of their state applicants versus their out-of-state applicants. Like, for example, I applied to UAB, but they're not very out-of-state friendly. I thought I would because I grew up in the Panhandle, close to Alabama, but they rejected me like 10 days after I applied. So definitely do your research about some of these schools. Some of them, like Peter said, don't take many out-of-state applicants at all. But if there's one piece of advice, even if all else fails, like apply to all of your state schools. Like I'm in Florida and we have a ton of state schools here. And even though if I didn't like want to move down to Miami, I still applied to those, because if that's the school that wanted me, like I wanted to go there. So definitely all your state schools, and then create a balance that looks at GPA, MCAT, and then your priorities, whether that be location, family, of those schools that are out of state friendly or private.
Well, I want to take, we just have a few minutes left, and I kind of wanted to go around and talk a little bit about what's your encouragement, right? So you were here in their seats a year ago, and what's your word of encouragement for folks who are in the weeds? Maybe maybe they've got their first draft of their personal statement. Maybe they wish they had their first draft of their personal statement done, and they're feeling stressed, and they hopefully are finishing finals or will be finishing finals soon. They're trying to balance all these different things that are going on in their lives. So I want to pitch it to you, Madison. What's your word of encouragement to leave everyone with this evening?
I think that if you can just keep in mind, all of the stress that I went through during the application process, as soon as I got that acceptance that I had been waiting on, it made all of it worth it. Honestly, you're over the moon, and for a lot of us, that one result was so many years in the making. I've wanted to do that since high school. So, I mean, I had been waiting 8 years on that one acceptance. And so just to see like all of your work come together and really just like, it just makes you so proud, and everyone is just so supportive of you and happy that like it really just made everything so worth it to me. And looking back, I would do it all again 10 more times just to be where I am today.
Not so amazing. Camryn, what about you?
Yeah. So first thing I would say, no matter how you're feeling right now, I want you all to know that you are not alone in how you're feeling. We have all either gone through this process, just starting it, or anticipating it. Like, you are not alone, and you have so many people out there who are going through similar things. But then on the flip side to that, I think it's really easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to others. And no matter how hard or how much different someone is from you, it is your journey. You have worked for your accomplishments. And at the end, it's your achievements that will get you to where you want to be. And I think that is so important to recognize. Like, someone's 528 MCAT is not something to dwell on. It is you and your efforts and everything that you have achieved that I think should be recognized. So know that you are not alone, but at the same time, like, it is your own journey. And as Madison said, it's all worth it in the end. And you'll look back and just thank yourself for all of those achievements all the obstacles you've overcome, and you'll be really proud of yourself in the end. And all the other people you worried about aren't going to matter when you're in. So if that's one piece of advice to take away, I definitely think it's that.
Peter, bring us home.
I would say that I think after this entire cycle, I would say that what's important is you may envision yourself having this really perfect path forward and that you've planned out everything. It's really important to stay flexible. One could argue that is one thing that's really important in becoming a physician is, you might, I don't know, have to retake the MCAT, or you might get a score that, screws up your plans for, a little bit. But being able to remain flexible and adapt quickly, I think, is one of the most important things. And I think being able to recognize that early on is really important. Just because it's really easy to get bogged down by one, setback, but this process is already so long that you don't have time to waste to be set back for so long. So just keep an open mind, remain flexible, have backup plans if needed. I think that's kind of the one piece of advice I would give is, nothing rarely turns out perfect. So remain adaptable to the entire thing.
Wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you all so very much for sharing your stories with us, for sharing your experiences with us. I know it's really valuable. I want to say thank you to everyone who offered their wonderful questions, because I know it really contributed to the richness of our discussion and just our ability to share more effectively. So thank you. We do wish you all the best. I just want to echo Peter in that there are setbacks on any road, but that doesn't mean that you're not meant to be a doctor. So it really is going to be about continuing to move forward, having those resources we were talking about, finding the right people to help you to be able to achieve your dream. If it's not the right MCAT score, if that Orgo class got you down, it's okay. There's still pathways for you to continue along this journey if it's the right one for you. So have a wonderful evening. We wish you all the best, and thank you again for joining us.